The Japanese have already said that they would see an attack and occupation of Taiwan by China as a threat to their national security. The Chinese and the Russians cannot believe their luck. They'd be delighted to see NATO collapse. If you had asked me to predict where we would be 5 or 6 years from that period, I would have got it wrong, terribly wrong. China at the moment is losing population. It was not expected to. India has now become the largest country in the world. That was not predicted even 10 years ago. All that was not only not predicted, it was totally unpredictable.
So Malcolm Rifkind, thank you so much for joining us here on Forecast 2050. You have had the illustrious honor of serving as Foreign Secretary here in the UK in the 90s. And what I wanted to ask you, given that you were in the ministry roughly, a little over 25 years ago, how much of what's happening today could you have possibly foreseen 25 years ago?
Well, very, very little, but that is not a new experience when you're dealing with foreign policy. My first job in the British Foreign Office was when I was Minister of State, number 2 to Sir Geoffrey Howe, who was Foreign Secretary. And that was in the early 1980s, in the middle of the Cold War. And that's when Brezhnev and Andropov and all these geriatric Soviet leaders were very threatening in many of the things that they did. And if you had asked me to predict where we would be 5 or 6 years from that period, I'm talking about from 1982, 83, I would have got it wrong, terribly wrong, because 6, 7 years later, the Berlin Wall had come down, communism, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had been banned, the Soviet Union itself had imploded and collapsed into 14, 15 separate countries. All that was not only not predicted, it was totally unpredictable. I was fortunate when Gorbachev and Mrs. Thatcher met, that famous meeting, I was there. Because I was a junior minister, deputy minister, but I was dealing with the Soviet Union. And I had an extraordinary experience, which I can tell you about in relation to what happened at that time. But it's all indicating that trying to predict, you can make your best guess, but you often get it terribly wrong, even when it's good news that's coming.
If it's so hard to predict, what is the benefit of preparation?
I can answer that question. First of all, you're saying, I'm talking about foreign policy, diplomacy. So first of all, your primary duty is to deal with the immediate problems, not predicting what might happen, but what already is happening. Is there a threat that exists? During the Cold War, there was a threat, which could accidentally have turned into a world war, but thermonuclear war. It never did, but that was always a possibility. But the job of the diplomats is to look at the existing issues, to try and anticipate the likely developments in the short term, and to prepare from them. So you prepare a series of options. If X happens, we do Y. But even then, you're only saying how you will immediately respond, because it depends how the other side then come back. Are they aggressive, or is there just a misunderstanding? Are they looking for a compromise as much as you might be willing to be?
So in the preparation of options, you have put together these options for heads of, like a head of state. How high is the variance? Is there this extreme all the way, from the left to the right tail?
I mentioned the Gorbachev visit to Mrs. Thatcher. Of course, that required a lot of preparation. We had an unusual, unprecedented benefit. We had, and it's now known publicly, but nobody had the faintest idea about it at the time, that a very senior Soviet KGB guy who led the KGB in the Soviet embassy in London was working for us and had been for years. And so when Mr. Gorbachev agreed to come to the United Kingdom as a senior diplomat in the Soviet embassy in London, he, of course, was one of the people briefing Gorbachev about Mrs. Thatcher, about what lines he should take, British policy, how he might take the discussions forward. What the Soviets never knew is he was simultaneously briefing Mrs. Thatcher on Mr. Gorbachev, how to handle him, what the issues might be, which would be helpful. Now, this is Gordievsky, his name was, Oleg Gordievsky. He eventually managed to get out of the Soviet Union in time, and he lived the rest of his life in England.
Statecraft back then, I think people have all seen, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. People have watched James Bond, and now we look at, say, the world today where President Trump is screenshotting private messages from heads of state. It feels like it is more chaotic. It feels like it's more impulsive.
Each stage of history has had different means of diplomacy because of the technical possibilities. So, for example, if there was, when we had a British Empire, if there was some emergency in India, we wouldn't know about it. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, you had the telegraph invented. You could actually send messages, but in a very truncated form. And so the way in which you respond or plan has to depend on the technical possibilities. Now, these have been transformed in recent times. So when you talk about, for example, heads of government using social media, and Mr. Trump is the arch exponent of this particular way, that is not only something that is possible, in the modern world it's inevitable. You cannot avoid that. We do it ourselves, but in different ways. The problem with Mr. Trump, because we're coming at a very early stage of this conversation, as we inevitably were to the great man himself, is not that he uses these techniques. It is the sheer recklessness of his behavior, not only the recklessness, but that recklessness combined, not with immorality, but amorality. He does not have moral standards. I received a splendid email from a friend to pass on to my other friends. It was quite one of these amusing exchanges. And it showed 3 pictures of American presidents. One was George Washington, one Richard Nixon, one Donald Trump. And it had George Washington saying what he actually did say during his life, "I cannot tell a lie." It then had Richard Nixon saying, "I cannot tell the truth." And it then finished up with Donald Trump saying, "I cannot tell the difference." And, it's funny, but it's also serious, because he cannot tell. It's not that he can't, he doesn't care to even examine.
In your time in politics and observing how the electorate changed their behavior towards elected officials and even seeing it today, people have these high ideals of politicians of the past were honorable post-World War II, that these ethics were held at a very high standard. Is that
I know what you're getting at, but I wouldn't put it quite that way. I don't think there was an assumption that all politicians or ministers or governments were honorable, because people knew from hard history that they were not, going back to Machiavelli, going back to ghastly people in the Middle Ages and at any time of history. No, it wasn't that. But what there was, I think the best word to use is deference. These are the guys in charge, and it was in those days all men, obviously, for obvious reasons in history. These guys are the leaders. Some of them were kings or emperors, so they had the added advantage of God-given rights to rule, and therefore you respected them even when the Tsars of Russia were in that situation. But so were others. So what has changed so dramatically in our time, and it's actually very healthy, and it doesn't just apply to politicians or ministers or prime ministers or presidents. It applies to bishops and archbishops, kings and queens, all sorts of people, judges. They can be criticized and are criticized. It's one of the virtues of a free press. It doesn't happen so often publicly in Russia or China, not because the people don't feel that way, but because their laws don't permit them to.
What you're saying is generally things have become more egalitarian and open, with people feeling like they have more right to criticize people in power.
What has changed, and it was always going to change as technology, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, in the Middle Ages, in hundreds of years ago, not just in Europe, but anywhere in the world, countries coexisted with each other, states coexisted with each other until they had a border dispute or a dynastic dispute or some reason for conflict, and then they went to war, and these wars were essentially local. Occasionally you had some great despot like Genghis Khan sweeping down through Asia and occupying huge swathes of territory for a temporary basis. All that happened. But what you have had since the middle of the 19th century is the world increasingly knows about the rest of the world. States find governments, prime ministers, presidents, not only choose to meet, but have to meet with their counterparts in other parts of the world. And why is that? It's not curiosity. It is because many of the issues that they're dealing with in one country also apply, not necessarily identically the same, in other countries as well. I mean, at the moment, if you're thinking of climate change, if you're thinking of COVID, a pandemic, quite apart from issues of peace and war, these are issues which all rational people realize have to be approached from a global basis if they're going to produce the right outcomes.
Again, I think people in the last, call it 30 years, have become very used to like borders not changing. You know, the last new country in the world was South Sudan in 2014. You were involved in the government during probably one of the more unusual regional conflicts of the 1980s with Argentina and the Falklands. Having experienced that, like a regional flare-up turn to armed conflict, and us seeing the signs of that today, do you think that the trend today, particularly as we move from a US hegemony to more of a multipolar world, do you think that accelerates? Like, international cooperation may still be needed, but actually international competition has more rise to flare up?
Well, you began by saying that we have less border changes or new states being formed than in the past. You could argue that, or you could give exceptions to that, but that's not the important point that I want to make. It is that the issue shouldn't be, are new states being created? Is that good or bad? It is, are they being created by the consent of the people who live in them? You know, it is one thing for a new state to be created because people who were once citizens of a greater country say we want our independence, we want to rule ourselves. And people, that will be very controversial and make great major problems, but there's nothing essentially unreasonable about the aspiration as long as it's realized peacefully and hopefully by mutual consent. We've had a number of examples of that, and you're no doubt aware of them. But what we also have is when autocrats, and it usually is autocrats, but now occasionally we're seeing might be Democrats as well, feel that they have such raw power and such an aspiration to control somebody else's territory that they either do it, as Russia did in Crimea, as trying to do in Ukraine, or aspire to it and threaten to do it, which is either worrying or not so worrying, depending on how much raw power the person making these threats has. If it's some tin pot dictator who hasn't got the military capability, even if they wanted to invade and occupy someone else's country, it's still an issue that is splitting the international community, that creates major problems, but it can be handled in a fairly predictable way. When it is not only the most powerful man in the world, but the leader so far of the free world, what calls itself the free world, whose very essence is recognition that you do not deal with territorial disputes by invading other people's country. You try to achieve diplomatic solutions or whatever, but you do not occupy other people's territory if it is already known that people who live there don't want you.
You know, one of the observations maybe last year of, like, say, how different world leaders were treated in the Oval Office. Mohammed bin Salman, there is oil, and so there's great kindness. While if you're like Vladimir Zelensky, your first meeting, you don't have the cards. The era of like softer power and rules-based order was like clearly starting to fray. Do you think like the signal to the world right now, and particularly to smaller countries, is you have to figure out how to develop some form of hard power, some form of bargaining chip? Or, I mean, was this always the case?
Well, first of all, I think you're drawing a general conclusion or possible conclusion as to the way the world is changing from the behavior of one particular individual. And I think the way you started your question by referring to how presidents or prime ministers treat their visiting colleagues, whether they deliberately try to embarrass them, denigrate them, and so forth, that is almost unknown. Even in the realms of the more nastier dictators around the world, they don't do that very often. Now, you'll get stories about Kim Jong-un in North Korea, how he treats his own people. We've seen these marvelous stories or not stories, actual television, of Putin sitting at one end of a very long table with his cabinet colleagues at the far end, making it clear who's the boss. Now, that's because he would like to be called Tsar Vladimir, and he knows he can't, but that's the nearest he can get to it. Now, but even in these cases, they would not normally behave in an publicly unpleasant way, with visiting prime ministers or presidents. That would be seen as a bridge too far. But it's not for Mr. Trump. He does it as a simple way either of expressing his irritation, or by showing who's boss, or by expecting that they must treat him as a super figure rather than just another head of state. That says more about his personal demons, his psychology. And Trump is an extraordinary phenomenon. I mean, it wouldn't matter so much if he wasn't so in such a powerful position. But what that says to me is this chap, Trump, basically with all the power he has, more power than anyone in the world, is insecure. He is insecure. He needs certain symbolic achievements. It's that kind of narcissism, which is amusing. We can mock him, but it's also dangerous, as we are seeing.
But do you think that behavior, even though it's an aberration, shouldn't elicit a response?
There has to be a response, but you've got to be careful as to what the response is. For example, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has had up till now a pretty good relationship. Not because he's conceded or made humiliating concessions. He's not going to in any way been acting in a nauseous way just to get Trump's benefit. But he's treated it as a traditional diplomatic issue where you don't publicly insult your opponent. You constantly look for openings, for diplomatic possibilities, to see whether they're willing to negotiate, to see what the possibilities are. So you keep the tone of your remarks down. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It depends on the circumstance. Some of the European prime ministers are being very blunt, calling Trump a bully, calling him a threat to the future of the world. Starmer's not using that language. Now, time will tell whose tactics are more appropriate.
If we look at the current generation of leaders, there's Modi over 70, Trump over 80, Putin 70s. We're currently in the sort of like elder leader.
A bit like Winston Churchill?
A bit like, well, also,
a bit like Mr. Gladstone?
I mean, maybe comparatively like pre-World War I, elder statesmen.
This is not unusual. Even in democracies, it's not unusual because sometimes people, and particularly in the modern world, when you can be elderly and you've still got all your mental faculties. I hate to tell you, Trump is the same age as me, or I'm the same age as him, almost exactly. About 3 months between us.
I think it's if you look at the date of birth of the US presidents going back to Clinton, it's like 1946, 1946, 1946, and then...
Well, there's been a cult of youth in recent years, and that's been true in Britain as well. When David Cameron became Prime Minister, he just turned 40. And the same goes for Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak. To be a Prime Minister in Britain, in the past, you couldn't expect it to happen until your mid-50s at the very earliest. I mean, sometimes in your 60s. The cult of youth has had some impact on that. Whether that's good or bad depends on the individual you're dealing with. And when you have some phenomenon like Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair in Britain, these are the two prime ministers I can think of since 1945 who've had the strongest personality and most effective prime ministerships, although some of it controversial. So that wasn't a cult of youth. That was because of their peculiar, interesting, fascinating personal qualities. Obama is an example in the United States. But what we are seeing in the autocratic states is presidents, usually through bogus elections, staying in power for very, very many years. Trump doesn't have that option. Even Trump hasn't, because I'm thrilled to see the American Constitution, for once, has got it totally right as to the maximum time he can be president. If we can get through the next 2 or 3 years, we're okay.
Yeah, it's like...
Because whoever follows him, even if it was Vance, Vance has got causes for concern, but Vance is not reckless. Vance is a highly intelligent guy, thinks very, very hard, discusses with people. Now, I may not agree with his conclusions. I'm not saying I want him to be president, but there isn't the recklessness and the sheer bizarre immaturity that Trump, I'm afraid, shows most days of the week.
If we're to move out, like definitely 25 years, this group of leaders will all have moved on. Are the systems durable enough to survive?
Well, part it depends on, even in the democracies. Let's forget about the dictatorships at the moment, because they're obviously in a special position. But thinking of the democracies, it depends on the political system. So, for example, when we realized in this country, or when my parliamentary colleagues realized that Liz Truss had been a disastrous choice as Prime Minister, she lasted 46 days, then lost the support of her colleagues manifestly and had to resign. Boris Johnson, who thought he had won a huge general election victory just a couple of years earlier, was forced out by his colleagues, as you will recall, without too much difficulty. The problem, if it is a problem the United States has, is you can only get rid of a president by impeachment. And that has proved to be near impossible. It might have happened with Nixon if he hadn't resigned. But that's about the only time it's looked in the 20th century as being a likely scenario. So it very much depends what, however, Trump's problems will be. If he loses significantly in the midterms, the end of this year, then that makes it much more difficult for him to get through new laws that he might wish to exercise. But he also, by then, is in the second half of his final term. Almost invariably, prime ministers and presidents become slightly lame duck. They lose their authority because they cannot frighten their own colleagues into automatically giving them their support. You see, Trump's always threatening to withdraw endorsements from any Republican who dares to criticize him in the United States. He can get away with that for about another year. By that stage, he won't have that power because his own term is visibly coming to an end.
And so do you think that what he has set in motion with respect to, say, the global humanitarian system, moving the US's funding role towards the UN, are you saying that actually in the scope of international relations, things will revert back to where we were?
I can only speculate because
that's what we're here for.
I cannot forecast the future, or nor even pretend to myself that I can. But if you look at the history of the 20th century and previous centuries, but particularly the 20th century, it is not a coincidence that what we've moved towards until now is a more global approach to how problems that are common to the world are resolved by the world. So, and that had particular resonance in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, when because of everything that had been dismantled or defeated, we had one of these rare historic opportunities, as it were, to start again. And America had become the world superpower. There have been people who have said America's power, even today, is so great. It's not a superpower, it's a super-duper power, and the only one that there is. So America, but with the full support of its European allies, the United Kingdom, France, other countries, not only initiated these global institutions, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, I can go through a whole list of them. They arranged it in such a way that America, in particular, had the greatest say. But in a sense, that was not surprising. Their economic power, forget their political power, their economic power meant if you were dealing with these sort of issues, it was inevitable they would have more influence than anyone else. Now, coming to your question, have we come to the end of that phase, you may be asking. I think you're asking. Trump would like us to. And people like Putin and Xi Jinping
would like it, yeah.
Would have a similar view, though less irrationally in their case, because they're more controlled by sheer argument rather than the rationality that Mr. Trump cannot escape from. So the question is that going to happen? That we revert to uncontrolled, I don't think we are. Let's assume, as he has to, Trump is no longer the issue in 2 or 3 years' time. And your interview is interested in looking ahead, not just the next couple of years. If you look at what the world will be facing, the biggest problems are ones that affect the world as a whole. And therefore, if they do not get global solutions or global progress, things get worse for everyone. The most obvious example is climate change, but that is followed by environmental damage to the planet, which is linked to that, but not just linked to climate change. Health issues, which can become, as we've seen, pandemics. And we had COVID at some stage. It is likely there will be something similar in the years to come. And international trade. And if there's one thing that the emphasis on free trade, on reducing tariffs, which is the way we were going until very recently, since 1945, it is no coincidence that that has coincided with the greatest economic progress, the greatest increase in prosperity, not just for the United States or for Europe, not just for the rich parts of the world, but the poorer parts, the traditionally very poor parts of the world in Africa, Asia, Latin America, India, China itself, have all become, or are in the process of becoming, middle-income states. And 20 years, 30 years from now, the vast majority of them will have reached that status. So that is an incredible human achievement, global achievement. And that means that increasingly, across the sort of issues that we're discussing, If you're approaching it as a government in a rational way, there is a common interest. Now, Trump is incapable of understanding or accepting that. He thinks there's an American interest, make America great again, but he doesn't realize America's greatness, in part, is because it has been the leader of the most successful part of the world, either in military matters through NATO, or in economic matters through the market capitalism system, which up till recently was dominated by America and Europe.
It's interesting you bring up this point. One of the points I've always kind of thought about is like if you take the anti-immigrant camp that obviously have been rising in political power recently, they're typically also anti-globalist and anti-internationalism, which I always thought was kind of counterintuitive, because if you are anti-immigrant, you should want the rest of the world to be a much better place.
I was once told that logic was the art of going wrong with confidence. People think because it's logical, therefore that's the answer. Human beings, I don't just mean politicians, I don't just mean presidents, all human beings, you and I equally, when we reach decisions, sometimes important decisions affecting our own lives, it's not just on the basis of logic, it's combined with experience, emotion, enthusiasm, avarice. Who knows what might influence our decisions.
Yeah, no, it's we've talked about this in previous interviews on the series around that, like, we're governments that were typically very good at responding to things that will kill us quickly and very bad at things that will kill us slowly, like very strong response to the pandemic, very sluggish response to something like climate change.
Wasn't that very sensible?
It was incredibly sensible.
When people are in the process of dying in very large numbers because of the pandemic, of course any government, democratic or authoritarian, has to treat that as a huge priority.
I suppose when you look at the longer term priorities,
it then becomes hypothetical, because even if you have what you describe as a consensus, I mean, take climate change, for example. Now, the attitude, and I happen to support the need for global action on climate change, on environmental issues. I'm not a scientist, but I see the evidence is pretty substantial and convincing. But you never get unanimity. And we have seen the sacrifices that have to be made today in order to reduce the growth of global temperature over the next few years. That has become much more difficult to sustain because of the sheer costs involved of making people change their whole lifestyle, of getting rid of carbon-related energy. Yes, everyone's moving in that direction, but a lot slower than originally would have been liked, for entirely rational reasons, even though uncomfortable reasons.
One of the things that kind of like hangs over this whole series and like hangs over us, like policy decisions, business decisions, technology, is like the changing demographics that we're going to experience, where in the next 25 years, we're going to transition from a majority young society to a majority old society. And yet a lot of the current social contract was built for an era with a very, very different point.
Well, let me make just 2 points, if I may. First of all, be cautious about that, because it's very easy. I'm not saying you're wrong. I haven't the faintest idea, but at the end of the day, nor do you. We can say on current trends, the demographics will be this, that, and the other. There'll be X billion people more than there are at the moment. They'll all be living in the cities. They will all be having difficulties getting access to energy. First of all, that may not turn out to be the case, because often people have got it wrong. China at the moment is losing population. It was not expected to. India has now become the largest country in the world. That was not predicted even 10 years ago. Or it might have been by some, but not seen as likely. So even in a short term, things that were thought to be inevitable in the future suddenly either become not the case or become much less so than was anticipated. But what you're also not taking into account is that many of the kinds of changes that you are quite properly and understandably referring to, the way in which they can be dealt with in the future, in 30, 40 years' time, will largely be by technology that we haven't the faintest idea at the moment what it will consist of. Now, just let me give you an example. It's going back to the beginning of the 20th century. In this country, and I'm sure the same applies in many other Western countries, 60, 70% of our population were living in the rural areas. Farming required huge numbers of manual workers. So an average farm might have had 30, 40, 50, 100 people bringing in the harvest, all this sort of thing. And when the tractor appeared, the combine harvester appeared, when other things meant that this was no longer going to be necessary, there was a huge prediction of massive rural unemployment, unsustainability. And to some degree, it was true, because what happened? A lot of the people moved to the towns or cities or urban areas and started new careers. So when you get these big changes, it's not that they produce either triumph or disaster. The people who are most harmed are those who, when they first feel the impact of these changes, are already in their late middle age, unable to start or contemplate a change of either habitat or lifestyle or career. It's a big problem, it's a challenging problem, but it's not one that affects the whole population.
No, it's interesting you bring up that, because part of the reason we have this demographic problem, and like China in particular, is you can sort of point it back to the population bomb, the book where we were like, if we continue on this trajectory, half the world will starve. And it assumed linear progress in agriculture and food production.
I haven't read Malthus, but I believe he predicted the world would come to an end because of the inability to provide the sustenance, the food, the requirements of the billions of people who'd exist in the world. Now, in fact, that's turned out to be complete nonsense.
Oh yeah. It's actually probably a good time to talk about, say, something like somewhere like China, where you have this population the country is gonna change so dramatically. I know you've spoken in the past before that like China's rise to become a superpower is well underway, if not probably in
But there's
place
an
now.
important point you haven't mentioned, which I think is fundamental to what's like, I can't predict for certain, but what's likely to happen in China. China is a more totalitarian state than almost any other country in the world, except North Korea, in the sense of the surveillance of its own population, the total concentration of power at the center. Now, you can sustain that in a poor country. You can sustain that in a poorly educated country. But China is simultaneously boasting, justifiably, that they now have a large middle class. And in Chinese terms, even if it's only 20% of the population, it will be 200 million people. Now, the whole point about the middle classes, that's why they're defined as such, is there are people who have had education. They've had the benefits of education, and by the benefits of education, they have an expectancy that they can make a contribution to the country of which they are part and be able to participate in the governance in its widest sense of that country. You cannot reconcile that with a totalitarian communist system. I strongly believe that in China, it won't be in 5 years or 10 years, it will be a process that over the next 20, 30 years, the very fact of successfully creating a middle class of educated adult Chinese men and women who will not tolerate the absence of basic freedoms that they see the rest of the world, not just the West, but even most of Latin America, most of Asia, most of Africa, has more personal freedom from surveillance by their government than China has. So that would be my prediction. Time will tell.
So this was a conversation we had in the first episode of the series with Tyler Cowen. We were talking about if you have a concentration of wealth or a concentration of power amongst a select few, but a highly informed and highly educated middle class below, you have these cycles of revolution and effectively like intra-elite conflict, replacing the old system with the new. He made the point that in a modern surveillance state, the power of the state to control the people will just, particularly with, say, artificial intelligence, will just move past the ability of almost any group of people, no matter how
Well, I think there is some truth in that. It depends on the circumstances, but the most important circumstance it depends on is whether the regime is able to continue producing economic growth and it benefiting the bulk of the population of which they're in charge. I remember the last time I was in China, I haven't been in China for a good number of years now, but...
Are you banned from China?
No, it's Russia I'm banned
Russia you're banned from.
Mr. Putin has banned me. I'm pleased to say it's a badge of pride. It was because of my criticism of what he did in Crimea. No, I could go to China, but I haven't been to China for quite a number of years. But when I was last there, in the margins of a conference that I was attending, I was able to have a one-to-one conversation with a very senior Chinese guy, not Politburo, but somebody pretty senior in the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not just being discreet, I can't remember who exactly he was. But we went for a walk in the gardens. In other words, he could talk exactly how he felt. And we were talking about comparing the two systems. And he said, you have to, I've never forgotten this, you have to realize that we, China, know perfectly well that we have a problem that one day we will have to address. In Britain or America or France or other Western countries, if the government is not succeeding, if it's failing in its duties in economic terms and quality of life, then the public vote them out of office after 3 years, 4 years. It may not change very much, but people feel better. They've punished the people who have caused this failure. We know that in China, we do not provide that option. That unless we can continue to provide real economic improvement for the public, who are not so much interested in politics, but interested in their own family circumstances, their own community, if our economic policy is not delivering, we do not give them a peaceful way to challenge that. At some stage, we recognize if we don't do something about that, that could become dangerous for the government itself. There's no evidence that that is happening at this precise moment. But what is of interest is that the pressure in China, one of the main pressures on the Chinese government, is to use more of the public resources that they get from the extraordinary amount of trade to benefit consumers in China, instead of diverting it to capital investment, which may be very important. But so this is a major criticism of the Chinese economy. And my expectation, but I'm not an economist, but I am a political person, is the Chinese government will increasingly have to take cognizance of that.
You're a big believer that military power is downstream of economic power and, I suppose, diplomatic power.
I'm not sure I'd say downstream. I don't normally quote Frederick the Great of Prussia, but he made one remark which I think is wonderful. I mean, it's very appropriate even to modern circumstances. He said, diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. Now, that does not mean if you have arms, you're using them. It doesn't mean you're warlike. It means if you're trying to find with a potential aggressor a diplomatic solution to some international problem, if that potential aggressor knows that if diplomacy fails, you have the means, if you choose to use them, to reach a solution by a different way, by military means, that concentrates the mind wonderfully. I've been very uncomplimentary about Mr. Trump, but that's one thing he understands. He understands it very well. I mean, the way he uses the power is bizarre in some respects, but he's basically saying, look, you will do what I want or I will make you do it. It's not a question of one or the other. Is that even if you are a proper democracy, but in a world that has some unpleasant governments and people in it, if you do not have the military means, first of all, to defend yourself, but secondly, to help make a contribution to wider global objectives, and if you don't have a military dimension to that, then you're much more likely to fail.
For the prior 50 years, soft power and humanitarian aid and development was seen as not maybe as equal, but it was a very important,
sure,
let's make this
happen. There are aspirations that somehow you can transform our world so that we all are peaceful and good citizens and seeking the right thing, and our governments echo that. And that's a very noble aspiration. I don't want to mock it, because it is a noble aspiration, and sometimes it works. Sometimes circumstances are favorable. But it's not, if you look at the history of mankind over the centuries, it's not normally been the dominant consideration. And there's no reason to believe that human nature has changed sufficiently in our time to make that judgment no longer relevant. I mentioned much earlier in this interview, I had the privilege of being present when Mr. Gorbachev met Margaret Thatcher. And that was a most extraordinary meeting because he was a product of the Soviet dictatorship. He'd been appointed. At the time, he was a convinced communist, and he believed that the Soviet Union was superior to other countries. But he was also he was a new generation, highly intelligent, and he did not just automatically approve of propaganda, even by his own country and government. We saw that very day when he came to see Mrs. Thatcher, and he came with his wife. And that itself was unusual because normally Soviet wives never appeared in public. And they were normally uneducated. Gorbachev's wife was a philosopher, philosophy graduate. She was an intellectual. She was very smart. And I've never forgotten when Gorbachev and Thatcher went off to have their personal tete-a-tete. Nobody else was present apart from the interpreter. I was asked to look after Mrs. Gorbachev, Madame Gorbachev now. And we were having the meeting in the Prime Minister's country residence called Chequers. It's an Elizabethan house in England, which we told the Soviets was her dacha, so they would understand what we were talking about. And it's a very interesting historic building. And I was showing her around. And she did not speak much English, but our ambassador spoke very good Russian, so he was doing the translation. And we went into the library. And she was fascinated by this library of antiquarian books. And she knew enough English to be able to read what each of the books were. I mean, she could see the name of the author or what it was about. She picked out 2 books. And she turned to me, she said, in Russian, but she said to me, "I'm so delighted to be in England. I've always wanted to be in the country of Hobbes and Locke." 2 17th century English philosophers with very liberal, by the standards of the day, political philosophies. Now, the reason I mention this was not just to say something about her. She and Gorbachev were modern people who knew there was a wider world which had much to offer. And when Gorbachev actually had power, he invented the phrase perestroika, glasnost, reconstruction, openness. He didn't intend it to lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but that's what it did. He started a process. And he also said to all the satellite states run by communists imposed by Moscow, from now on, you're on your own. Don't expect us to come to your rescue if your public don't like you.
I mean, the subtext there is that there is a lot of power in soft power, be it cultural exports and ideas.
It's part of a broader process. It's not sufficient in itself. Even the phrase itself, soft power, I think it was Nye, Lawrence, who invented it. It's a relatively modern concept, but it means a lot. In our case, for example, I remember going to Poland when it was communist, and I had a secret meeting with Solidarność, who were banned at the time. I had the meeting in the British ambassador's residence. And we deliberately had not announced we were going to have this meeting for obvious reasons until it had happened. And then we told the BBC World Service. And within 24 hours, every Pole in Poland, they all listened in those days to the BBC World Service or Voice of America or whatever it was. And so that was soft power. It was a way in which we made a political impact without firing a single bullet.
There's that line in Orwell in 1984 where, it's like, you must always be at war with there must always be an enemy. After the fall of the Soviet Union, and this is like Francis Fukuyama, the end of history kind of point of view, that like once...
Fukuyama has always regretted he made that remark. He knows that he got that wildly wrong.
Oh, it's completely, because it's, you can see how he got there.
Well, I knew exactly what he meant at the time, because communism had collapsed as an ideology. I mean, literally collapsed. The Berlin Wall had collapsed. The Cold War had ended. And it was a reasonable thing to say, this is the most fantastic period that we've known for 200 years, but not the end of history.
But do you feel having an opponent when you're moving policy forward, be it like I'm Irish, like after like the financial crisis was one of the probably great boons to the Irish government at the time was to point to the IMF and be like,
sure,
these are the bad guys, but like we have to do what they say. Countries, when they don't have an adversary, be it a nation state and or someone, politicians have less capacity to make required difficult changes to put those countries on a good, strong path.
Well, I mean, politicians in any democracy are primarily interested in the domestic consequences of their actions because they want to be re-elected and continue in power. So what is happening internationally is of interest to certain people, depending on their business background or personal, professional background, but it only becomes important to the general public if relations are becoming so bad that they might lead to some war, some physical conflict.
But was it not a great boon to UK politicians to be able to point at the EU and say these were the bad guys?
Well, some Eurosceptic British politicians might do that, and there would always be controversy as to whether it was justified. The truth of the matter is, when you're dealing with democracies, most of the time, there are not good guys and bad guys. each government, each political class in whichever country are looking at their own domestic interests and their own perception of the world. So it doesn't make them bad guys. It only makes them bad guys when, like Putin, they invade other countries. They show total disregard for other people's liberty, such as their own political prejudice. Now that is what is dangerous. Otherwise, you're dealing with various forms of peaceful competition, whether it's in trade or it's in political ideas or in whatever sphere of life you're referring to. And when people start saying, "Oh, it's all back now. It's bad as ever. It's terrible," their judgment is very poor. Their knowledge of history is very poor. We're not back to where we were during the Cold War. Let me illustrate it in this way. During the Cold War, if God forbid it had become a hot war, Brezhnev or whoever was running the Soviet Union, their forces would have attacked the West, starting in Berlin, because they were already there. And the whole of Eastern Europe was controlled by them. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic states, all were part of the Soviet bloc. And therefore, militarily, aggression began right next to France and Germany. Today, if Putin, in 2 or 3 years' time, wanted to attack NATO, he would be starting 1,000 miles further east. The threat that exists today is not to France or Britain directly, or Germany directly. It is certainly to the Baltic states, to the countries of the Baltic area, because of his desire to try to recreate as much of the Soviet state as he can. He knows he can't get it all, but he would like to expand it. But that is of a totally different order. And if after almost 4 years of war in Ukraine, he still only occupies 18-19% of Ukraine, the idea that he could defeat NATO, even with or without America, is ludicrous.
We've seen these conflicts move into stasis, take Ukraine. Do you think that ends up looking more like a Korea over time?
Permanent conflict.
Effectively.
It is entirely possible. It depends how this immediate period of actual war comes to an end. I mean, all wars end. They end either because one side wins and the other loses, which is what we did in the Falklands when we defeated Argentina and recovered the islands and so forth. And there are other examples of that. Sometimes wars end when there's a genuine compromise. Both sides want to stop the war, know that they haven't the military capability of winning the war as they would like to, and the issues that cause that conflict are then gradually able to create normality. The third is the frozen conflict, when you haven't got a solution, and then you end up like North and South Korea, still technically at war with each other, or India and Pakistan over Kashmir, or Cyprus, Israel and the Palestinians. These are the frozen conflicts, and Ukraine at the moment is looking more likely to end up as one of those than the other options.
I live in the US right now, and I would say in some cases there's, Taiwan is brought up as a frequent, here are the things we need to spend money on in order to protect the island or interdict an invasion of the island. I'd be curious for your take as someone who actually understands the Chinese, in the next 25 years, what do you think happens?
I think it's entirely rational that the United States, whoever is president, should see the single most important strategic challenge they face, potentially threat, is from China. And what we in Europe have to understand, we know this, but we don't think about it enough. We are an Atlantic power. America is an Atlantic power, but it's also a Pacific power. It's got oceans on both sides. And historically, if we think of the 20th century, the Pacific will never be far from any president's mind, because they got drawn into the Second World War, not because of Hitler, but because of the Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack on American territory in Hawaii. So the issue of Taiwan is not just about a pro-American government in Taiwan that is an ally of the United States. It is the strategic implications, the geopolitical implications, if Taiwan was occupied by communist China. And this explains why it's not just the United States, but Japan, South Korea, many of the other countries of the region, Asian countries, that are equally alarmed. And India has just become part of the group of 4 countries, including America, Australia, Japan, who are not yet a military alliance, but they're looking at ways of containing China, even if they don't use that word. So why is that? It is because if China did one day occupy Taiwan, effectively it would make them the dominant power in that whole part of the Western Pacific. And that has crucial implications. The Japanese have already said that they would see an attack and occupation of Taiwan by China as a threat to their national security. Now, they say that because most of their trade, imports and exports, goes down the West Pacific Ocean between Taiwan and Chinese mainland. And that would make that effectively a Chinese sea controlled by China, who would allow there to be passage of ships if they so chose, but could stop it equally if it would give them a massive power. And I mean, you take the case of the United Kingdom, I was surprised to discover that something like 20% of our seaborne trade goes through the Straits of Malacca and up through the South China Sea. Now, it's called the South China Sea. It shouldn't be called the South China Sea. It's much nearer Southeast Asia than it is China, but it suits the Chinese to have that terminology. So this is all about not just Taiwan, but the much wider consequences. And my guess is, and I'm now going to try and make an assumption as to what China's ultimate objectives might be, not in 5 or 10 years, but in 30 years. I think they would want China to become the dominant naval power for the western half of the Pacific. So the Pacific would be shared by China and the United States. Now, whatever you think about the rights and wrongs of that would be a massive geopolitical defeat for the United States. Because at the moment, it's not just Taiwan, it's Guam, it's Okinawa, it's various other islands where it has bases, and it's had that since the 1940s. That is why there's a logic in saying that America has to take account of that.
Not to get all Kissinger-esque on this point of view, but it's reminiscent of conversation about like the great power balance, say in Europe. I don't think anyone any reasonable person aspires to go back to great power style diplomacy.
Unless you're a great power.
Unless, yeah.
And that is the whole point of Trump's personality. America is a great power, no question. It's the most, as we've seen in the Venezuela operation, as we saw in the attack on the Iran nuclear program, America can do things militarily that no other, even great power at the moment could do. Russia or China could never have done anything of the competence and success of these military operations. But from Trump's point of view, he would not object to a Putin-style world where the great leaders, so-called, got together and decided what the small boys had to listen to and observe. Now, Putin's problem is he isn't a great power any longer, by any standard. He's more important in many countries, but China and the United States are the two superpowers. And Russia's total population, forget the size of their landmass. It's a bit like looking at Greenland and thinking it must be very important. Look how big it is. Russia's population, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, is now 130 million. That's a lot of people, but it's France and Germany combined. Their GDP, because of the useless way they run their economy, broadly the same as Italy's. That doesn't make you a superpower.
No.
What they have is nuclear weapons that gives the ultimate military power.
If great powers are coming to take that sort of point of view on global affairs, what do you do as a smaller country?
Well, some would say you do what you're told.
I mean...
But no, well, first of all, you combine with other countries. There's 180 members of the United Nations, 180. Now, a lot of them are very small islands in the Pacific or the Caribbean or whatever, or even in land. So they're not going to have any meaningful impact, and they know that. But when you look at the wider world in terms of important countries, first of all, you have the European countries, which geographically are quite contained, but economically, militarily, diplomatically, still have huge global influence and in some cases power. But you also have countries like Brazil. You have countries like Australia and Canada. You have India, most importantly. You have Indonesia. I could give you a dozen other very important countries, Turkey, Poland, all of which can't be ignored. And therefore, even the 2 or 3 superpowers cannot by themselves run the world. That is simply not possible. And that's very healthy, actually. The world has moved that way. The fact that countries like Turkey like Indonesia, like India, which used to be irrelevant to global issues, relatively speaking, can no longer be treated that way. And even smaller countries that have been remarkably successful. I mean, take Israel, for example. Its influence in the Middle East is hugely greater than its population by itself would justify.
You do have to align yourself somewhat, be it like Canada recently.
Well, this is the absurdity of
China.
This is the absurdity of the current White House priorities. If you want to make America great again, that's assuming America had stopped being great, which itself is silly. But even if you start from that premise, what is it that makes America great? America is already the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military alliance, not only that the world has, but the world has ever had. Now, it is pretty dumb if you are the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military force in the world, for you, by your own actions, to seem to be deliberately appearing indifferent to that alliance, to be prepared to contemplate it weakening, and to make various threats implying that you don't have to be there in the first place. I mean, the Chinese and the Russians cannot believe their luck. They would be delighted to see NATO collapse for all the obvious reasons. So that is, by itself, a curiosity that cannot continue, certainly beyond Trump. And maybe Trump himself, within himself, knows that that is something he has to come to terms with. But what is also the case is if you want to be making America even greater, rather than great again, even greater, you do it by building alliances. You do it by making friends. Now, the greatest loss that America is experiencing as we speak is a loss of trust. Even its friends, traditional friends, are saying, well, we cannot rely on America to be helpful. So where does Mark Carney go as the Canadian Prime Minister? He goes to China. Now, not to become a political ally, but saying we have to redirect our economy, our trade, if we're going to be constantly having tariffs imposed upon us. So it is the sheer irrationality of how Trump's actual policy is in complete conflict with what is obvious to an undergraduate to be America's political interests.
NATO generally sits under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. The North Koreans have proven that the ability for small countries to build nuclear weapons is possible even in a very constrained environment. In a world where people, smaller countries in particular, feel more threatened, and the ability to access nuclear technology has never been easier, what's your prediction for how that problem evolves over the next 25 years?
First of all, of the 180 countries that are members of the United Nations, if I had to pull a figure out of the air, I'd say 150, 160 of them do not have and have never experienced any existential threats. They have occasional disagreements with their neighbors, but their neighbors are militarily or economically not that different to themselves. So if you get a conflict between Thailand and Cambodia, for example, it's sad, it's tragic, but it's containable in that way. When you get to look at nuclear weapons, actually the number of nuclear weapon states we have today is far fewer than people feared 30, 40 years ago. I said there's 180 countries in the UN. I think it's 10 have nuclear weapons. And even if you subdivide those 10, 2 of them, India and Pakistan, only have them because of each other. And sadly, one has to acknowledge, since they had nuclear weapons, they've never gone to war with each other, even conventional war. They've had the odd incident on the borders, whereas they had 3 serious wars between 1948 and getting nuclear weapons. Now, that's an uncomfortable truth. Secondly, a country like Israel has a nuclear weapon for its own survival, not to be used aggressively. And countries like France and the United Kingdom are never going to use nuclear weapons except as an ultimate deterrence against Russia, or I suppose theoretically China one day, but that'll be a long time from now. So the issue of nuclear weapons is a serious one, but it's one that has actually not had the short-term horrific consequences that it might have had.
De Gaulle was obviously a very iconoclast character of the 20th century. He had personally experienced and been aggrieved by American intransience. Churchill also famously, after the war, was very frustrated with American intransience towards Poland. If Trump changes, there's someone different in office. Do you think that the wheel that has been set in motion that may have validated, say, early de Gaulle's point of view of French nationality and independence or anti-nuclear weapons, Churchill's point of view on that the UK needs to remain less dependent on the US?
It will depend who becomes president of the United States over the years to come. The fact that Europe and the United States occasionally have strong differences, that has been true for the whole of the last 100 years. Churchill and Roosevelt had major clashes during the war, which have been very well recorded. Harold Wilson refused to send British troops to Vietnam. Margaret Thatcher, I was in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. She had deep affection and marvelous relationship with Ronald Reagan, but they had deep divisions on nuclear weapons when Reagan almost did a deal with Gorbachev to abolish them, and she thought this was totally unrealistic and very foolish. And then the worst moment was when Reagan invaded Grenada, which was not only a territory of the Commonwealth, former British territory, but at the time, nobody had pointed out to the president that the head of state of Grenada was Her Majesty the Queen. Because Grenada, although independent, like Canada and Australia, still had the Queen as their head of state. And Margaret Thatcher was absolutely livid. And Reagan was very embarrassed and actually, had to apologize, basically, he was a gentleman, so he did apologize, unlike some.
So I suppose history, like you say, we're not all the keenest students of history, and many of the things we see today are things...
But I've mentioned the things that have differed. What has bonded Europe and the United States, particularly the United Kingdom and the United States, in the case of the United Kingdom, partly common language, English language, which it makes a huge difference. The Five Eyes intelligence cooperation system, but also America interpreted its national security as being tied up with European security. Because they'd been, against their initial wishes, ended up in 2 world wars in the 20th century, and NATO had been incredibly successful in preventing a third one, as history has shown us. So any rational American president would still judge that although there will be differences, there are far fewer than the common bonds.
Well, let us hope that the future American presidents are more rational than the current one. Sir Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.